Tonight, we begin in 1947 at the cusp of a world-changing moment as the midnight hour strikes, marking the end of British rule in India. The sun had set on an empire that spanned continents, and as the clock ticked toward a new dawn, India's fate hung in the balance. You feel the weight of history thick in the air, as the ink of the partition plan was still wet when the first borderlines were drawn on the map. The streets of Delhi buzzed with celebrations. Fireworks lit the night sky, a burst of colours reflecting the joy of independence. But there's something else in the air too, a sense of foreboding, an unease in the crowd. The boundary which split the subcontinent into two nations was less of a geographical marker and more of a fracture that ran deep into the fabric of the people. India, as you know it today, had just been born. The Indian subcontinent was divided into two nations, India led by Jawaharlal Nehru and Pakistan led by Muhammad Ali Jinnah. The partition, done hastily and hurriedly, was an act of sheer political necessity. Yet even as it came into being, it wasn't born out of a singular, clear vision. Historians still argue whether the partition was inevitable, whether the rise of religious nationalism had made it impossible to maintain a unified India, or whether the British simply left in haste, leaving behind the complex legacy of colonial rule. You probably won't survive this, and neither did millions of others when the announcement was made. It was the beginning of one of the largest mass migrations the world had ever seen. But more than that, it was the spark for a story that would shape the next decades in ways that no one could have predicted. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop your location and local time in the comments. I'm curious where in the world you're tuning in from. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. As the minutes tick by, let's slip into the shoes of the millions caught in the whirlwind of this new world order, this new reality that neither India nor Pakistan could truly prepare for. The world had been watching the grand unfolding of India's independence, but no one was prepared for the sheer human cost that would follow. Imagine for a moment you're caught in the chaos, a refugee swept up by the tide of history, no longer knowing where your home was, only knowing it had vanished in the blink of an eye. As borders were drawn on maps, people were uprooted from their homes, families separated, and communities destroyed. The line of division was not just a geographical line, it was a line that split hearts, divided cultures, and created an insurmountable chasm that would take generations to heal. This was the mass migration of partition, the largest in history. Historians still argue whether the violence that accompanied the partition could have been avoided, or if it was simply the inevitable consequence of the British retreat and the deep-rooted divisions of religion, culture, and politics that had festered for centuries. Within months, nearly 15 million people were displaced, their homes turned into dangerous battlefields as communal violence raged in the streets. You would hear, if you were in the midst of it, the anguished cries of those who were separated from their loved ones forever. In some places, the bloodshed was as brutal as any battlefield, but there was no military uniform, only the terrified faces of ordinary men, women, and children trying to survive. The psychological scars left behind would be felt for decades. The violence was indiscriminate, with Hindus, Muslims, and Sikhs all caught in the crossfire. You might have found yourself just a year ago living peacefully in your home, only to suddenly be pushed from it with nothing but the clothes on your back. As families fled for safety, thousands were murdered, raped, or simply disappeared into the chaos. And as the violence spread, the British, in their final act of colonial power, turned a blind eye. The aftermath, though, would be far from forgotten. Imagine now the burning images of a time gone by, a distant and heartbreaking memory that still lives in the stories of countless families across India and Pakistan. The legacy of partition isn't just written in history books, it's passed down through generations in whispered conversations and tear-filled eyes. But there's another facet to this story, the one that we often forget in the shadow of the destruction, the creation of two nations with their own flags, their own identities, and their own futures. India and Pakistan had been born in the fires of conflict, and their paths would be forever entwined though they would never be the same again. The dust of violence and upheaval hadn't even begun to settle when two new nations emerged from the partition: India and Pakistan, both seeking to forge new identities, but both carrying the same ancient wounds. India, vibrant and diverse, full of promise and challenges, stepped forward with its first Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru, a man whose vision would set the stage for the newly independent nation. Meanwhile, Pakistan, led by the charismatic and determined Muhammad Ali Jinnah, began its journey as a homeland for Muslims, with dreams of a society free from the complexities of Hindu-majority India. You can almost feel the weight of those early days, the rush of adrenaline, the excitement of a new beginning. But there was a quiet undercurrent beneath the celebrations, a recognition that this was not a seamless birth, not a joyous occasion for all. The two countries' paths, though born of the same struggle for freedom, would soon diverge. Historians still argue whether partition was a necessary act of self-determination or whether the seeds of division had been sown long before the British left. Nehru's India leaned towards secularism, emphasizing unity in diversity, while Jinnah's Pakistan was driven by the idea of a nation for Muslims, a belief that would shape its future in ways that India could never fully understand. The flags of both nations were raised on that fateful day, and with them the national anthems filled the air, echoing across the subcontinent. But while both nations had gained independence, they were now separated by more than a line on a map. They were divided by their very ideals, cultures, and ways of life. India, with its vast array of religions, languages, and traditions, stood as a testament to the potential of pluralism. Pakistan, born out of the idea of Muslim unity, struggled to reconcile the dream of a unified state with the diverse ethnic and sectarian groups within its borders. But the birth of these two nations didn't just mark the end of colonial rule. It set in motion decades of tension, political struggles, and unending conflict with the shared history of the subcontinent constantly tugging at the new borders. The people of India and Pakistan, despite their newfound independence, were left to deal with a fractured legacy that would never allow them to fully escape the past. And as you imagine yourself walking through the streets of these new nations, the euphoria of independence begins to fade, and you realize the magnitude of what has been lost. The struggles of these early days would resonate for generations, with both countries haunted by their past, as they each struggled to define what it meant to be Indian or Pakistani. As the ink dried on the maps and the first flags of India and Pakistan fluttered in the breeze, the real work of nation-building began. But there was a twist. The borders had been drawn quickly, almost recklessly, with little consideration for the lives they were about to uproot. The Radcliffe Line, drawn by a British lawyer with no knowledge of the region, carved through the subcontinent, dividing families, villages, and even entire cities. It wasn't just an abstract line on a map. It was a sudden rupture, a violent boundary that tore communities apart. You can almost feel the chaos in the air, lives uprooted in an instant, homes left behind, and streets suddenly becoming treacherous places where former neighbors became strangers. The story of the Radcliffe Line is one of the great ironies of partition. The British, in their haste to leave, had entrusted the task of drawing the new borders to Cyril Radcliffe, a man who had never been to India and who knew nothing of the deep cultural and religious divides that shaped the region. Historians still argue whether the hurried nature of the border's creation was a deliberate effort to destabilize India or simply an unfortunate outcome of the British desire to exit quickly. Either way, the result was the same: families and communities were cleaved in two. You can imagine the confusion and fear in the eyes of those caught in the middle. One moment you're living in one nation, the next you find yourself on the wrong side of a border, unsure if you'll ever see your homeland again. The fallout was immediate. Cities like Lahore, once thriving centers of culture and trade, became divided along religious lines. For the people living there, it was as if the ground beneath them had split open, leaving them stranded on opposite sides of a chasm. Muslims, Hindus, and Sikhs suddenly found themselves separated by a line they didn't ask for, forced to pick up their belongings and flee to safer territories. As the months passed, the situation worsened. You'd hear stories of families who had lived together for generations now being torn apart by this new and arbitrary division. The psychological scars left by the Radcliffe Line would endure for decades, with each side of the border constantly haunted by the memories of those they left behind. And yet in this madness, the impact of the border was not limited to the people living near it. In the distant capitals of New Delhi and Islamabad, the leaders of the two new nations were already dealing with the fallout. Nehru, faced with the massive task of integrating millions of displaced people, understood that India's strength would lie in its ability to embrace diversity. Meanwhile, Jinnah's Pakistan found itself struggling to define what it meant to be a Muslim nation in a region rife with ethnic and sectarian complexities. Historians still debate whether the partition was destined to fail given the complexities of the region's history, or whether it was simply too early to tell if the new nations could truly thrive as separate entities. The border, however, was just the beginning. What was meant to be a peaceful separation of two nations had turned into an ongoing story of conflict, a conflict that would shape the fate of millions for decades to come. By the time the partition lines had been drawn and the first waves of refugees had crossed them, the real struggle was just beginning. As both India and Pakistan tried to navigate their new identities, one area became a focal point for the tension that would plague them for decades: Kashmir. This strategically significant region, nestled high in the mountains, became a symbol of everything that was unresolved in the aftermath of partition. Imagine it now, the region, cradled between the two new nations with its lush green valleys and towering peaks, a place of natural beauty, but a constant political flashpoint. Kashmir had a special place in the minds of both Indian and Pakistani leaders. The region's Muslim-majority population made it a natural target for Pakistan, which had been founded as a homeland for Muslims. But the region's ruler, Maharaja Hari Singh, was Hindu, and he faced a difficult choice. His kingdom was geographically positioned between two hostile nations, and when the threat of invasion from Pakistan loomed, he decided to accede to India, seeking protection in exchange for becoming part of the Indian Union. That decision, however, sparked a chain of events that would lead to war and a conflict that has persisted for decades. Historians still argue whether the Maharaja made the right choice or if he was simply caught in the crossfire of two nations determined to claim Kashmir as their own. Whatever the case, the immediate result was war. In 1947, just months after the partition, Pakistan launched a military campaign in Kashmir, leading to the First Indo-Pakistani War. The conflict was short but brutal, with both sides suffering heavy casualties. When a ceasefire was brokered by the United Nations, Kashmir was left divided. India controlled roughly two-thirds of the region, while Pakistan held the rest. But the larger issue, the question of Kashmir's future, was far from resolved. You can feel the tension in the air even today, as the region remains one of the most heavily militarized in the world. The divide between India and Pakistan has been marked by violence, political maneuvering, and unending disputes over territory. Kashmir, despite its beauty, has become a battleground, a symbol of the unresolved questions of partition. And as you imagine standing there, overlooking the vast expanse of the Kashmir Valley, you're struck by how this one region encapsulates the struggle for identity, sovereignty, and the lingering shadow of partition. The conflict in Kashmir also marked the beginning of a dangerous cycle of wars and diplomatic standoffs between India and Pakistan. You can sense the underlying tension between these two nations, both eager to assert dominance in the region, each unwilling to give up what they consider rightfully theirs. And as you drift off into the quiet of night, the echoes of those early wars continue to shape the modern-day struggles that Kashmir faces today, each battle for control reinforcing the divide while the people of Kashmir remain caught in the middle. As the years passed, the wounds inflicted by partition continued to fester, particularly as religious divisions deepened in both India and Pakistan. The horrors of the violence that followed partition, the massacres, the rapes, the forced conversions, had not only scarred the land but also solidified the lines between Hindus, Muslims, and Sikhs. These divisions, which had once been fluid, became hardened and entrenched. What was supposed to be a peaceful transition into independence had given birth to something darker, a violent sectarian divide that would plague both nations for generations. India, despite its secular founding principles, struggled to hold on to its unity in the face of mounting religious tension. You can imagine the feeling in the air in cities like Ahmedabad or Delhi, where Hindu-Muslim riots would periodically flare up, sparking violence that often resulted in loss of life and property. The brutality of these clashes seemed to confirm the fears of many in the country, those who believed that religious unity was the foundation of a nation, and those who believed that a secular democracy could transcend these divisions. Historians still debate whether Nehru's secular vision for India was realistic, or if the country was doomed from the beginning to be defined by its religious identity. In Pakistan, the story took a different turn. Created as a homeland for Muslims, Pakistan found itself grappling with not just religious unity but also ethnic and regional divisions. While Pakistan was predominantly Muslim, it was also home to a variety of ethnic groups, Punjabis, Pashtuns, Sindhis and Baloch, each with their own distinct cultures and languages. The question of what it meant to be truly Pakistani was never easy to answer. Many Pakistanis felt disconnected from the ruling Punjabi elite, which dominated the political and military power structures. You'd feel this divide if you lived in Karachi, a city that saw its own violent clashes between ethnic groups, especially as Pakistan's military asserted more control over the nation's policies. The deeper you look into the history, the more complicated the situation becomes. Was Pakistan truly the Muslim state its founders had envisioned, or was it destined to be a patchwork of conflicting identities? And could India maintain its integrity as a secular state in a land where religious identities ran so deep? These questions still linger today, like smoke from a fire that never truly goes out. As you walk through the bustling streets of Lahore or the quiet alleyways of Mumbai, you might hear whispers about these unresolved issues, remnants of a time when partition's ghosts were still fresh. And yet the divisions persist, ingrained in the fabric of daily life, shaping the political and social landscapes of both nations. Religious conflict fueled by the specters of partition continues to be a defining characteristic of India and Pakistan's modern histories. From India's growing Hindu nationalist movement to Pakistan's struggles with Islamic extremism, the seeds of division planted in 1947 continue to grow. In the streets of every major city, you might feel the ever-present tension between the different religious communities, a reminder that partition's legacy is not something confined to the past. It is alive, and it is shaping the present. The shadow of partition didn't just cast itself over politics and religion, it reached into the very lives of the people, shaping the way both India and Pakistan saw themselves and each other. At the heart of the partition were two men, Jawaharlal Nehru and Muhammad Ali Jinnah. Each of these leaders had a vision of what their respective nations should become, and in many ways their ambitions would dictate the future of their countries. Nehru, India's first Prime Minister, was a man of vision. He saw India not as a collection of religious groups, but as a diverse nation united by shared democratic values. His vision for India was one of progress with a commitment to secularism, social justice and industrialization. He wanted India to be a modern, vibrant democracy that embraced its diverse cultures, languages and religions. Yet as much as he pushed for this unity, he found that the weight of history and the religious divisions left by partition made it almost impossible to fully unite the country under these ideals. In cities like Lucknow or Varanasi, the remnants of those divisions still lingered in daily life, despite Nehru's best efforts to keep them at bay. Historians still debate whether Nehru's dream of a secular India was too idealistic, given the religious tensions that had been heightened by partition, or whether his policies simply couldn't keep up with the fast-changing political realities of post-colonial India. On the other side, Jinnah, the founder of Pakistan, had a very different vision. To him, Pakistan was the land where Muslims could live free from the tyranny of Hindu-majority India. His dream was of a nation where Islam was the foundation of society, a place where Muslims could flourish without fear of domination. But Jinnah's Pakistan quickly became a divided nation in itself, with its own set of contradictions. Pakistan was home not only to Muslims, but to several ethnic groups, each with their own languages, traditions, and aspirations. The Punjabi elite that dominated the country's political life was often at odds with the diverse ethnic communities that made up the nation. In cities like Karachi, you could feel the tension between the different ethnic groups, Sindhis, Pashtuns, and Baloch, all vying for their piece of the political pie. Historians still argue whether Jinnah's vision of Pakistan as a Muslim homeland was doomed to fail, given the internal fractures that became more pronounced as the years went on. You can almost feel the weight of their ambitions, each man hoping to create a legacy of peace and prosperity for their people, yet both were haunted by the divisions that partition had so dramatically instilled. For Nehru, India's unity was always a work in progress, never fully realized. For Jinnah, the dream of a unified Muslim state became a bitter struggle for survival as Pakistan's internal fractures became harder to ignore. You can imagine them both standing in the early days of their new nations with all the possibilities before them, but also all the burdens of history weighing heavily on their shoulders. The dreams of both men would shape their nations for decades to come, and their legacies would continue to inspire, though sometimes divide, millions. As you drift deeper into the story, you start to see the irony that lies at the heart of partition. While Nehru and Jinnah dreamed of creating peaceful, unified nations, the very divisions that led to the separation of India and Pakistan have only grown more pronounced over time. The ghosts of partition still walk the streets of both countries, casting long shadows over the political landscape and shaping the destinies of millions. And you can't help but wonder, could Nehru and Jinnah have foreseen what would happen after their dreams took root? The legacy of partition didn't just shape the political future of India and Pakistan, it seeped into every aspect of their cultures, particularly the arts. Both nations, struggling with the trauma of their past, turned to literature, music, and film as outlets to process and convey the deep, lingering wounds of partition. As the decades passed, these artistic expressions became vehicles for telling the untold stories of displacement, violence, and the enduring search for identity in a fractured world. In India, the partition's pain found its voice in countless novels, plays, and films. The work of writers like Khushwant Singh and Saadat Hasan Manto delved deep into the human experience of partition, painting vivid pictures of the violence and emotional destruction that followed. Manto in particular became a literary legend known for his raw, unapologetic portrayal of the chaos, the brutality, and the unthinkable cruelty of those days. His stories, often too controversial for the time, explored the blurred lines between love, hatred, and survival. Historians still argue whether Manto's depiction of the partition was an act of catharsis or whether it served as a warning about the horrors of religious division. His work was not just an exploration of historical events, but a piercing examination of the emotional and psychological scars left on the people who lived through them. In Pakistan, the aftermath of partition was also keenly felt in the arts, though its expression was often more politically charged. Pakistani writers, poets, and filmmakers wrestled with the country's identity, trying to reconcile the vision of a Muslim homeland with the deep ethnic and regional divisions that existed within the country. The partition created a yearning for a united singular identity, a longing for the idealized vision of Pakistan that Jinnah had promised. But the reality of Pakistan's diversity often contradicted this vision, leading to a national identity crisis that would be explored by poets like Faiz Ahmed Faiz and writers like Intizar Hussain. The tension between religious unity and ethnic diversity continued to haunt the narrative of Pakistan's culture, and the partition's scars never fully faded. You might even be able to imagine the quiet solitude of an artist sitting in a dimly lit room, pencil in hand, grappling with the question of how to convey the complexity of a divided world to an audience that lived it. The pain of partition, though, didn't just echo through the words of literature, it also reverberated through the melodies of music and the scenes of film. Bollywood particularly began to use film as a means of revisiting partition's legacy, turning out films like Garam Hawa and Earth, which portrayed the devastating personal impacts of the divide. The soundtracks of these films, full of melancholic melodies, became anthems of sorrow, resonating deeply with a generation that had inherited the trauma of partition. As you listen to the soft hum of these old melodies, you can feel the weight of history in every note. The music, though born in the agony of partition, becomes a testament to survival and remembrance. Artists and filmmakers in both India and Pakistan used their mediums not just to tell stories, but to preserve the memory of those lost in the chaos, to immortalize the struggles of the refugees, and to create a cultural identity rooted in the shared experience of partition's horror. But even as the arts helped to heal some of the wounds, they also acted as a constant reminder of the damage that had been done. The partition, in a way, became a cultural watershed, one that each generation had to reckon with, either through the lens of nostalgia trauma, or in the case of the newer generations as a distant memory they could never fully understand but would always inherit. As India and Pakistan forged ahead trying to carve out their futures, another dimension of the partition's legacy began to make itself felt, its impact on the economies of both nations. The division not only separated families and cultures, but also disrupted entire economic systems. Shared markets, industries, and trade routes were split, and the newfound borders created an immediate sense of disarray. Yet amid the turmoil, both India and Pakistan had to rapidly adapt to their new realities, trying to rebuild their economies while dealing with the long-lasting effects of the mass migration and the destruction of shared infrastructure. In India, the task of rebuilding was monumental. The country, though rich in resources, faced the challenge of integrating millions of refugees, many of whom had lost their homes, their land, and their livelihoods in the violence of partition. The capital, New Delhi, swelled with displaced people, many of whom came with nothing but their memories and a burning desire to rebuild their lives. For a time, India's economy was on shaky ground, but it had one advantage: its vast and diverse population, coupled with Nehru's commitment to industrialization, gave it the potential to grow. Under Nehru's leadership, India embraced a policy of planned development, which sought to use state resources to establish industries, build infrastructure, and create jobs. However, the scars of partition's upheaval continued to leave their mark on India's economic progress. In the years that followed, India's economic growth was slow, constrained by internal divisions, bureaucratic inefficiency, and the vastness of the country's challenges. Across the border, Pakistan faced its own economic challenges. The loss of eastern Bengal, later to become Bangladesh in 1971, was another blow to the economy. But in the immediate aftermath of partition, Pakistan had a different set of obstacles. The country inherited a largely agricultural economy, with much of its wealth concentrated in the hands of a few powerful landowners, primarily in Punjab. The newly formed government in Pakistan sought to industrialize quickly, but the challenges were immense. While Pakistan had its own resources, the lack of a cohesive economic framework made growth difficult. Partition's immediate aftermath left Pakistan struggling to integrate its diverse ethnic groups, each with their own economic interests and regional disparities. The division of resources, such as water from the Indus River, also created tensions that continue to affect the two countries even today. Historians still debate whether partition's economic disruption was a necessary evil in the creation of two nations, or if the economic fallout could have been mitigated with better planning. The answer isn't simple. What's clear is that the legacy of partition shaped not just the political and cultural landscapes of India and Pakistan, but also their economic futures. It set in motion cycles of poverty, inequality, and economic fragmentation that took decades to address. And even today, both nations struggle with the consequences of that disruption, their economies still influenced by the divide that partition created. As you imagine the first days of independence, with the hustle and bustle of millions of displaced people arriving in cities and villages across both nations, you feel the uncertainty in the air. The promise of a better life was hard to reach for many, and the road ahead for both India and Pakistan would be long and fraught with challenges. Yet in the midst of this, the resilience of the people refugees, farmers, laborers, and intellectuals alike formed the foundation of both nations' eventual rise. The economic wounds of partition, though not fully healed, have since given way to remarkable stories of progress and ambition. But they also serve as a reminder of the price paid by those who were caught in the whirlwind of history, trying to survive and rebuild in a world that had been torn apart. As we approach the final chapter of this journey through history, it becomes clear that the story of partition did not end in 1947. It reverberates through every aspect of life in India and Pakistan, shaping their futures in ways no one could have predicted. The aftermath of partition remains a living, breathing part of the cultural, political, and social fabric of both nations. The legacy of those days of division, violence, displacement, and survival continues to affect the people of India and Pakistan even as they attempt to move forward into the future. Today, the partition is not just a chapter in history books, but a story told in whispers, in the eyes of those who lived through it, in the hearts of families who still carry the pain of lost homes and broken families. In India, there are millions of families who trace their roots back to the places they were forced to leave, places they have never seen again, but have carried with them through generations. In Pakistan, the same is true. Families whose ancestors fled from places that no longer exist, or who still live with the memories of what was lost. The partition scars are passed down in these families as they try to make sense of the history that shaped their existence. Historians, writers, and filmmakers continue to wrestle with the narrative of partition, each attempting to untangle the complex web of identity, memory, and trauma that it created. Was partition inevitable, a product of history and politics that could not have been avoided? Or was it a catastrophic mistake, a division that could have been prevented, one whose consequences are still unfolding today? Historians still argue about this. Some say that partition was the only way to address the religious divisions that had been fostered during colonial rule, while others claim that it was a tragedy that could have been avoided, a product of British imperial decisions and the failures of leadership on both sides. You can almost feel the weight of these unresolved questions, the quiet hum of doubt that lingers in the air. The truth, perhaps, is that there is no single answer, no way to fully understand the consequences of partition in a single moment of time. It's a story that continues to unfold as India and Pakistan grapple with their shared history, their fractured past, and their uncertain future. The legacy of partition still shapes their politics, their relationships with each other, and their sense of self. In some ways, they are still the nations born from partitioned two countries, separated by a line, but forever tied by the history that made them what they are. Now, as you drift off into the quiet of the night, think of the people caught in that moment in 1947, the millions who were forced to leave their homes, their families, their way of life, and start anew. The people who built new lives from the ashes of partition, whose stories continue to echo through the generations. This is their legacy, the stories of survival, of struggle, and of hope that continue to shape the world today.